Hello and welcome to this PIR Live Event webinar brought to you by Partners in Research Canada. My name is Ben Hobbs and I will be your host today. If you're joining us live, remember that you can ask questions at any time by clicking the Q&A, which is located in the bottom center of your screen, and typing your questions into the pop-up window. I will relay these questions to our guests during the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you see a question in there that you would also like the answer to, you can prioritize it by clicking the thumbs up icon, which should be located just below their question. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest today, Dr. Navin Ramankutty, a professor at the University of British Columbia School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Ramankutty. I'll let you take it from here.
Right, thank you very much, Ben. Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're from. It's a real pleasure to talk to you from Vancouver in British Columbia. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about how the food we eat relates to the global sustainability challenges. When we typically think about global environmental problems, the first thing that comes to mind is climate change. And we think about cars, we think about heating, we think about flying in planes and so on, but we rarely think about how the food we eat affects the world's environment. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that today, and also about how we can solve some of these problems, and I'd love to hear your ideas as well. I'll start by sharing my screen now in a second. Okay, so farming for a sustainable planet. How can we farm in better ways than we are today? The first thing to realize is that we farm a huge part of our world's landscapes. This is a map made by my students and I, where we used images from satellites as well as ground-based information to just see where we farm on the planet today. So the greenish colors that you see there are the world's croplands, places we grow things like wheat and rice and soybeans and so on. And the kind of reddish brownish areas are the places where we graze animals. Together, nearly a third of our world's landscapes are today used for agriculture by just one species for growing the food that we eat. 1/3 of our world's land. The only places where we don't grow crops are either too cold, like in northern Canada or Russia, or too dry, like in the Sahara Desert or the Australian Desert. The only remaining places where we could continue to grow crops, where the climates and soils are still very good, are in the tropical rainforest. You can see those places in South America, in the Amazon or in the Congo. Those are places where we could still be growing crops, but they are covered in tropical rainforests. And in fact, as some of you may know, that's where most of the deforestation is going on today. And that's because we are starting to use the last remaining lands for agriculture. So this has enormous implications as well. But it's not just about the amount of land that we use for agriculture. We've also improved our technologies over the last 50 years or so. We have improved the productivity of our agricultural lands, both by irrigation, where we are applying more water on the land, or by fertilizer use, essentially plant food, where we are able to provide the nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus that plants need. So together, both by expanding our agricultural lands and by improving the intensification of our agricultural lands by adding more water or fertilizer or mechanization, we have greatly increased food production over the last 50 to 100 years. The intensification has especially been really, really impressive. This is just one example of that, which shows the yield of maize or corn in the United States going back to the 1860s. And it shows that our yields of maize were about 1.5 tons per hectare. A hectare is about the size of a football field. So we were able to produce 1.5 tons per hectare back in the 1860s. But today,
hey, Navin.
Yes.
Sorry, I'll just stop you there for a moment. I think we're having some audio issues with those headphones. Do you want to try just using the computer? We'll give that a shot.
How does that sound?
That sounds good to me. Thank you. I think we'll try that.
Okay. Do you want me to repeat anything?
Maybe just that last slide for us. That'd be great.
The one before this? Or?
That one right there. Perfect.
All right. Okay. So this slide, I was trying to say that it's not just about the amount of area we use on the land, but it's also about the intensification of our agricultural lands. We've been adding more irrigation and more fertilizer use, essentially plant food, to improve or to increase the amount of food we can produce on a 1 unit area of land. So through our intensification, we have improved what we call crop yields. And this is just one example. It shows the yields of maize in the United States going back to the 1860s. We used to produce about 1.5 tons per hectare. A hectare is about the size of a football field. We used to produce about 1.5 tons of maize per hectare back in the 1860s. And today we produce about 11 tons per hectare. That's an increase of about 7 times. So essentially in about 100 years, we are now producing 7 times more maize than we did back in the 1860s. So together, this has been an enormous success. While over the same period, human populations have gone up. But while human populations have gone up, we today produce more food per person than we did back 100 years ago. So together, this has been a great success. In fact, even while human populations have gone up, the number of people who are hungry has gone down over time. This is all great. But what I want to talk to you today is that our success actually comes with an enormous cost as well, a really big environmental cost. Firstly, when we clear lands, when we cut down forests for producing food, that results in a whole bunch of species who lose their habitats, and it results in what we call biodiversity loss, sometimes even species extinctions. Second, agriculture is one of the biggest user of water on this planet. When we think about water use, we often think about brushing our teeth or taking long showers, but that's really a drop in the bucket, pun intended. The biggest user of water on this planet is for farming. And this is an image of the Aral Sea taken from satellites. The Aral Sea is in Kazakhstan in Central Asia. And the first image you see on the top is from 1987, and the second image you see there is from 2009. The Aral Sea has dramatically shrunk over this time period. And the reason is because they took the water. There were 2 rivers that feed in the Aral Sea, and they diverted that water to grow cotton, and they used that water for irrigating cotton. So, all our t-shirts are made from the consequence of the fact that we use cotton for our clothes is that we depleted part of the Aral Sea. It's not just about water use, but it's also about water pollution. A lot of you may have seen things like this. This is a lake which is covered by blue-green algae. When we use fertilizers on our farmlands, some of that fertilizer goes into making crops and increases yields, like I've shown you before. But a lot of that fertilizer also gets left behind in the soil, and then it enters, lakes and rivers and coastal ecosystems. The algae there also love these nutrients, and they start growing and results in these algal blooms. And when we have these algal blooms, after a while, when the algae die, they often remove oxygen from the water and create these dead zones, resulting in fish kills because fish do not have oxygen. What about climate change? When we think about climate change, as I said, we don't think about food systems, but our food system is actually a big part of the climate change problem as well. When we clear lands for agriculture, when we clear forests, that deforestation releases carbon dioxide because plants are made out of carbon. When we grow rice paddies or when we have livestock grazing on the landscapes, they result in what's called anaerobic decomposition, where decomposition happens without oxygen and results in methane emissions. So these methane emissions, methane is also a greenhouse gas that causes climate change. And it's actually a more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. I talked about using fertilizers on our landscape. Some of that fertilizer goes into the crops, some of it gets into the water, causing algal blooms. Well, another portion gets into the atmosphere in the form of something called nitrous oxide, which is an even more powerful greenhouse gas. So put together, all these 3 gases resulting from agriculture, some people estimate that about a quarter of our climate change problem comes from our agricultural systems. So together, farming has major environmental problems. It causes deforestation, biodiversity loss, climate change, depletion of water resources around the planet, as well as water pollution. But the problem of feeding people has not gone away either. I told you how we produce more food per person today than we did back 50 years ago. but we still have hunger in many parts of the world. This is a map showing the world's hunger. And look at sub-Saharan Africa. Many parts of Africa have very high undernourishments of 35% and above. Essentially, people in those countries are not getting enough to eat, even though we have surplus food in many other parts of the world. So there's huge inequality in our food system as well. And we still haven't solved the problem instead of, in spite of growing all this food. And some scientists think that we even need more food in the future. Firstly, because the number of people on this planet has been going up. And today we are at about 7 billion people. And by 2050, we think we'll be at around 9 to 10 billion people. And all of these people are also getting more wealthier and are consuming more. And so scientists have estimated that we'll need to double the amount of food we produce by 2050. So a major challenge that we face is to how can we feed people without destroying the environment? And that's the research that I work on, and a lot of people, a lot of other amazing people around the world are working on. And I'm hoping that I can inspire some of you to start asking these questions as well. I'm going to talk just about 4 possible solutions that scientists have talked about and some of the things that I worked on as well, but I'd love to hear some of your own ideas as well. So I'll go through each of these 4 things in turn. The first one is to say, why are we deforesting around the planet for food? Let's take 2 cases, which is Brazil and Indonesia. These 2 countries alone contribute to about half of all the deforestation we see on the planet. And there's some images there showing you some examples. Most of this is for growing soybeans. That's the image on the left, or oil palm. That's the image on the right there. What are soybeans and oil palm used for? Soybeans, well, some of us eat tofu. That's a small portion. Most of those soybeans are fed to animals, and then we eat those animals later. And as I'll tell you a little bit later, that's not a very efficient way of getting our calories. Oil palm is found in a whole bunch of other things. I don't think any of us directly eat oil palm. But oil palm goes to make biodiesel, which is used in cars in some places instead of fossil fuels. That's actually a good thing in some ways because we are not using fossil fuel oils, but we are cutting down forests to grow this oil palm. Oil palm was also used in many industrial products. It's also used in chocolate and many other products. So do we really need to cut down our forests to grow these things, or can we find other ways to get our the resources that we need? So one of the things many scientists and many policymakers around the world are working on is trying to figure out ways to halt deforestation. For example, can we source our soy or oil palm from places where we don't cut down forests for doing so? Another thing people talk about is that we should use our water and fertilizers more wisely. It is good to use some fertilizer and some water to increase the productivity of our lands. But we have currently what's called a Goldilocks problem. In some places on the planet, we use too much fertilizer and too much water. In other places on the planet, we don't use enough. This is a very complicated table, but I just want you to look at the bottom there, which shows the nutrient balance in different regions of the world. So on the left there, which left bottom saying -52, that's Western Kenya. And it's saying that they don't have enough nutrients in Western Kenya. The soil is depleted of nitrogen. On the other hand, you look at northern China there with +227. Northern China has too much nitrogen going into the soils. Can we solve this problem? Can we provide nutrients in places where people need it, but not use too much in places we don't need it? We have to solve this Goldilocks problem. So those 2 solutions are looking on the supply side, like how can we grow our food better? But people are increasingly talking about on the demand side. Do we really need all this food? We're talking about doubling food production by 2050. Do we really need to do so when in fact we are wasting 1/3 of the food that's being produced? Yes, that's 1/3 of the food that we produce on this planet. We take all this water and fertilizers and land to produce this food, and then we throw it away. We throw it away sometimes because the food rots before it gets to the plate, but a lot of times we also throw it away because we don't finish our food. So those of you in high schools who are thinking about whether to finish your lunch today, think about this problem as well. And then increasingly, scientists have been talking about the need to eat less meat. And why is that? So here's an example to show you why that's important. Let's say you're eating a veggie burger. That's the top right image. And you need some grain to grow that veggie burger, okay? But instead, if you ate a chicken burger, well, okay, you need some chicken to make that burger, but that chicken needs to be fed. And it turns out that you need 3 times as much grain to feed that chicken because the chicken has to keep itself alive as well. Instead, if you had a hamburger, turns out that roughly you need about 10 times as much grain to produce that cow that produces that hamburger. So this is not a very efficient way of getting our calories. If we ate plant food more directly, that'll be a more efficient way of getting our food. That leads me to actually something quite interesting that's come out just in the last month. This is an image of the Canada recent food guide. And this is actually quite consistent with what many health and nutritionists have been telling us for a long time. The first most important thing to say is that in your plate, half of your plate should be made out of fruits and vegetables. Very few people do that. I must say that I don't do that. Half of my plate is not full of fruits and vegetables. I'm trying increasingly harder to do that. On the bottom left, it says choose whole grain food. We eat a lot of processed food, but that's not very good for our body and our health. There's a lot of evidence that the good bacteria in our body like more fibers, and whole grain food can give you those fibers. Eat more protein food, it says. It doesn't say eat meat. You can get protein from a lot of sources. What our body needs is protein. This doesn't mean that we all need to become vegetarian or vegan, but we can get our protein from lots of different sources. And finally, don't eat so much sugar. Make water your drink of choice. So this is very consistent with a lot of things people have been talking about, that eating more plant food and less meat can actually be good for both the planet and for your health. There are lots of other solutions that people talk about, like organic agriculture or urban agriculture, eating insects, going vegan, reducing food waste, and so on. There are lots of solutions there. I don't have time to talk about them. Maybe some of you have ideas as well. So I'll stop there and ask you for your questions, but also maybe ask you for your ideas on what are some of the solutions that you think about. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ramankutty. Just before we move into the Q&A, I'd like to remind those classrooms to direct their questions to the Q&A, which is located in the bottom center of your screen. So our first question today comes from the grade 5s at Pelmo Park Public School in Toronto, and they're wondering, how will a warmer, drier environment affect our plants?
Yes, that's a really good question that I didn't touch on. So this is a sort of a vicious cycle with agriculture. I told you about how agriculture affects the climate, but that climate change also affects our agriculture in turn. And so a warmer, drier climate will affect agriculture in different ways in different places. Canada actually happens to be one of the places that might actually benefit from climate change in some ways, because a warmer climate might actually increase the length of our growing seasons. But the second part of that question about drier climate might actually make things worse. So in some parts of Canada, like Western Canada, where we grow our grains, even if as it gets warmer and drier, that might actually affect crops badly. The places that we really have to worry about is places like Sub-Saharan Africa, places which are already really quite hot and quite dry. As those places get hotter and drier, there are estimates that our crop production is going to fail in dramatic ways. Lots of scientists around the world have estimated that already over the last 20 years, we've lost about 5% of our crop production due to climate change, and this will only get worse in the future.
Our next question today comes from Mrs. Lofthouse's classroom, and they're wondering, what if we ate fish as our main protein source?
That's an excellent question. So there are different ways of getting our protein sources, and fish is an excellent way of getting our protein source. It's also good for our health. We have to do it also in sustainable ways. As some of you might know, a lot of fisheries around the planet are also in decline. And so they're moving towards farming our fish on the lands, which also has environmental problems. So there are trade-offs, but people have shown that certain forms of fishing can actually be more beneficial both for health and for the planet compared to, say, eating beef. Many others are also talking about other forms of protein, like eating insects, which might be even more efficient, but getting people to eat insects is more challenging than getting people to eat fish.
So our next question today is from Mrs. Wong's classroom, and they're wondering, what is Canada doing to find a solution to make farming more sustainable?
What is Canada doing? Not enough, I would say. I mean, there are in Canada a lot of the I would say a lot of the faith is being placed in technologies, new precision agriculture kinds of technologies and machinery, which I know can actually help uh, farming become more sustainable. Precision agriculture is where you develop machinery so that you can apply just the right amount of water or nutrients you need on the landscapes. So that's one possible solution, but many other people are talking about moving towards more environmentally friendly forms of agriculture, such as organic agriculture or more broadly called agroecological practices. Canada does support some of this kind of agriculture, but we need more research and development, more support for more environmentally friendly agriculture.
So we've got a long way to go there. Mr. Vanderscott's classroom is wondering if you have any recommended strategies for reducing the amount of food that we waste on a daily basis.
That's an enormous challenge that I face in my own household, I must say. Every day, I have two kids, 9 and 6 years old, and every evening when I open out their lunch bags, half their food is not eaten. And, I eat some of it myself if it's still palatable. But we are starting in our household to think about how can we waste less food in our household. On a larger scale, I think that, there are solutions that can go at different scales. On a larger scale, there's probably ways of encouraging, say, restaurants to serve less food. Some of the portions of food that we see being served in restaurants is too big, and people often can't finish what there is. In cafeterias and in schools and colleges, maybe there are ways to reduce the amount of serving sizes. So I should qualify this by saying the food waste problem is different in different places. So the solutions will be context dependent. In North America, Europe, and other places which are fairly wealthy, most of the food waste happens post-consumer. It happens after it gets to your plate, or it happens in restaurants. Food waste in developing countries and poorer countries happens before it gets to the consumer. It happens because they don't have refrigerated trucks, or they don't have good storage systems for the food. So the solutions there will be slightly different.
Mr. Babcock's class is wondering if buying local is an important thing to consider when you're grocery shopping.
That's an excellent question. And there's been a lot of confusion about this recently. A lot of people thought originally that eating local is an environmentally friendly way of obtaining your food. Increasingly, the research shows that that's not necessarily true, although I'm still supportive of local foods, and I'll say why. First, most of the environmental impacts of agriculture or of the food system seems to happen on the farm itself. So a lot of the things we do on the farm matter more than the transportation of the food. On the other hand, eating our foods more locally connects us more to our local farmers and encourages them possibly to farm in more environmentally friendly ways. So we are connected more closely to the source of the problem if we eat our foods more locally. We have to be cautious, though, that when we eat our food more locally, we don't make the problems worse. So for example, if you're eating tomatoes in the winter and those tomatoes come from a greenhouse, and that greenhouse growing tomatoes in a greenhouse in the winter can actually take a lot of energy. The greenhouse is heated and can actually be worse than importing our foods from somewhere else. So eating locally can be good, but we have to do it in ways that make sense.
Is there any crop in particular that has a larger ecological footprint or causes a more greenhouse gas emissions?
That's a great question. I would say some of the major crops on this planet, the major crop on this planet is maize. It's the most amount of area. And if you ask, what is that maize being used for? Very little of that maize is actually going into food. Most of that maize is used to feed animals, and some of that maize is used to make corn ethanol for fueling our cars. A lot of it is exported as well, and we don't quite know what people do with it. It goes into making high fructose corn syrup and cornstarch and things like that. So that's a crop that is not, it's not delivering food calories, and it has huge environmental impacts. Rice and wheat, on the other hand, most of the rice and wheat is actually eaten by people, and so that's actually a good thing. Rice, on the other hand, produces methane emissions, which is a major greenhouse gas. So we have to figure out ways of reducing the methane emissions from rice production. But yes, the agricultural problem is not the same across all crops. Some crops are better than others. Some of the ancient grains that people used to eat, right, like millet and sorghum, these are crops that actually provide a lot of calories, they provide fiber, and they actually have, they can grow in more drier conditions. So a lot of people are also talking about switching away from the major crops that we currently grow. Rice, wheat, maize, and soybeans cover most of the planet today. And that we start eating a more diverse diet, that can also be beneficial for the planet.
The grade 7/8 in Miss Simon's class are wondering how much more food would we have to grow in order to have no one starving in the year 2050?
Yeah, so the estimates from most people is that we will need to grow about 2 times as much food than we do today. But just producing more food doesn't mean that people won't be starving. And that's the big challenge today. So if you take the amount of food calories we have on the planet today, on average, we have about 2,800 calories per person if you just distributed it uniformly. We need only about 2,000 calories, and we are able to produce about 2,800 calories. The problem we have today is what some people call a distribution problem. There is plenty of food on this planet for everyone. There are a lot of poor people on this planet who just can't afford to buy that food. And so we have a poverty problem that we need to solve at the same time that we solve the food production problem. So going into the future, people estimate that we need twice as much food, but if just producing that food is not enough, we also need to figure out how to get it to the people who need it.
The grade 5s in Mrs. Green's classroom are wondering if we should cut down on the amount of fertilizer that we're using for our agriculture.
Absolutely. We should cut down what I would say is excessive use of fertilizer in many parts of the planet. So if you look at the Midwestern US, we probably need to only apply about 50 to 75 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. I'm sorry to use numbers here, to grow our food. But farmers apply about double that. They apply about 250 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. And you can't really blame the farmer for that, because farmers are trying to make a living from this, and fertilizer is fairly cheap, and they don't know what the weather is going to be like when they plant their crops. So they usually typically try to apply as much as possible so they get the most a harvest at the end of the year. But we have to figure out ways to help farmers to reduce their amount of fertilizer that they're using on this planet. And there are many ideas out there, but I'll just leave it there.
Miss Bonocard's classroom is wondering if climate change is going to affect our food sources, and could we go hungry in the next 200 years because of this?
When we say we, is it talking about Canada as a whole?
I would assume it would be as a global population.
My worry about that as a global population is, the answer is probably no. Not all of us are going to go hungry. The problem is that with climate change, people in sub-Saharan Africa who are already hungry are going to get hungrier. That's the problem we need to solve, is of inequality around this planet. So most of us in Canada and United States and Europe will probably survive just fine, because even if our food production fails, we are wealthy enough to import our foods from other places. We might have short-term crises when food prices go up for a little bit, but we can deal with those crises. My big worry is about other poorer parts of the planet where climate change is happening and people are poor, and they are unable to cope with it as easily.
I wouldn't expect you to know the stats just off the top of your head, but do you know approximately how much of the land in Canada is being used for farming?
That's a good question. I don't know the stats off the top of my head. My guess is probably, I'm going to guess 10%.
10%?
Northern, or probably even less than that. We use a third of our world's land for agriculture. In Canada, it's probably less because a lot of northern Canada is not farmed at all. I looked that up, and they can email me later. I can find the numbers.
Sort of the last question I'll try to fit in here before I have you talk a little bit at the end here. We're wondering would you consider gradually converting to a meat eater, from a meat eater to vegan, or would you consider taking steps from a meat eater to vegan? So sort of that gradual change or a more immediate change?
I would suggest a gradual change. I should start by saying I eat meat personally. I used to be a vegetarian for a long time. And then I decided that for me, this has been a journey as well. I decided at some point that eating local foods is more environmentally friendly. So I started moving towards local foods, but then started eating meat. And now I realized that that was probably not the most environmentally friendly move either. And so now I'm trying to cut down meat consumption. The more positive way of thinking about it is, as I showed you the Canada Food Guide earlier, is to say that we need to be eating more fruits and vegetables. So instead of saying, let's cut down meat, let's talk about eating more plants and filling up half of our plate with plants, and then reducing the amount of meat we eat. And it's also not just about reducing the amount of meat, it's about reducing the type of meat we eat. As somebody asked earlier, it's about reducing the amount, it's about eating fish instead of eating beef. Beef production by itself seems to be the single biggest problem. It's much, much higher than any of the other types of meat. So even if you switch from eating beef to eating chicken, or eating beef to eating pork or fish, or if it's palatable to you to eat insects, that can make a big difference as well. So at the universities here, we have something called Meatless Mondays, where the cafeteria decides not to provide any meat on Mondays. Or maybe on weekends, you decide you want to eat meat. Those can make big differences. So we don't all need to go vegetarian or even vegan. Vegan means not eating eggs or dairy either. But making small changes can have a big difference.
Well, we're almost out of time today, but before I end things, I was hoping to have you speak a little bit about your career path, and if you have some advice for students who are watching today who are considering something similar for their future.
Yeah, the most important thing I can say about my career path was none of this was planned. As kids, we always assume that we need to know what we are going to do in the future, and I did not. I had no idea what I wanted to do. I just kind of stumbled through my career. I grew up in India, and I lived there for the first 20 years of my life. And I went into engineering for my bachelor's degree. And I did that without really knowing what it was about. It's basically, I went into it because that's what my parents thought I should do, and that's what my brother did, so I did that too. It's only towards the end of my engineering degree that I did pretty well, but I realized that that's not what I was really curious about or passionate about. And so when I came to the United States to do my graduate degrees, I got interested in the climate change problem. And so I did a master's degree in climate science. I worked on the climate change problem. And then I realized that a lot of the climate change problems it's not enough to study the climate problem that's up in the atmosphere, but we need to study what's happening on the land. And so I started getting interested in kind of the issues that are happening on the land, like deforestation. And that's how I got into the agricultural issues, realizing that the biggest user of the land on this planet is farming. So I got interested in farming as a body of learning. I got interested in how we grow our food and what that does to our environment, and that's what I do today. So none of this was really planned in some ways. I was mainly following my nose, in the sense that as I went along, as I learned, I became curious about new problems, and I followed along. So that's been a really fulfilling and enlightening journey. So what I would tell students today is that you all have your own super strengths. One of my friends says that every human being has a super strength. They just need to figure out what it is. You may not know it right away, but follow your nose. Follow things that you're curious about and where your passions lead you. You never know where life takes you.
Well, that's all the time we have for today, but thank you, Dr. Ramankutty, for taking the time to talk to us about how we can address some of these global food security issues, and for taking all of our questions.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
So next week on PIR Live Event, we'll be discussing climate change with Dr. John Small from Queen's University. More information about these webinars and other PIR educational programs are available at pirweb.org. Thanks for tuning in, and have a wonderful day.